Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, joined by Josh Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project. Welcome back on impeachment trial week, Josh.
Yeah, happy Friday.
What a week. I'm just going to stop by saying that.
Let's just start everyone saying, it's off script, right? But like, what a surreal week. And I mean, just as, like for us doing our work, this is going on, we're paying attention to, it's like, I don't know about you, but like, I am tired.
Well, at a real, and I'm hearing this from a bunch of other people. I mean, it's hard to, do your regular work.
Yeah.
Or just, proceed with your regular life. Not that life is all work, but also know that for, 8 or 9 hours a day, you want to be in front of the trial and trying to pay attention to it.
It's just going on. I mean, it's like weird going to pick up my kids and be like, no, I'm not going to play this outside school at pickup. Like there's some lines I don't want to cross yet.
Well, I've found myself walking around with it on
headphones. I've had it in my headphones. Places.
Connective tissue, when you're in transit. So,
all right.
So of course, you know this if you're listening to this, but as we're recording this mid-morning Friday and missing a little bit of the trial.
I'm sweating.
It's been the first week. This is day 4 because of Labor Day of the impeachment trial of suspended Attorney General Ken Paxton, of course, being tried in the Texas Senate. We also released the rest of the latest University of Texas Politics Project poll, by the way, this week. Again, as most of you would probably know, we kind of rushed is too strong a word, but we moved with some alacrity to, get the results from that poll out last Friday before the trial started. And so this morning, after a decent interval, we've released the remainder of the poll. You'll find the documents in the usual places at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And there you'll find the usual, all the usual treats that come with this. Summary sheet, extensive crosstab files, many graphics for top-line results and crosstabs, trend items that are updated for the major political leaders in the state and conditions in the state. And again, tons and tons of downloadable graphics for your use in discussing, teaching, lecturing, putting together presentations for your clients. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the podcast, and we'll talk some more, of course, a lot about it in the coming weeks. There's a lot in the poll, but it would be semi-ridiculous to not start by talking about the Paxton trial. We talked quite a bit in the last podcast about the Paxton-related results from that poll, and this week has been much more taken up, as we've said, by the thing itself. I've kind of tried to stay out of the lawyer's lane as much as I can, although it's hard not to get in law and order mode when you're watching hours and hours of testimony and trying to parse out what the lawyer's strategies are, what the witness strategies are,
right?
How the judge is dealing, interpreting all this.
Especially when all the witnesses have been lawyers too.
Right, and the judge is the lieutenant governor. But all that said, so, let's start a little more general. After with a few general things. After a bunch of uncertainty, we got a few somewhat clear indicators of what the state of the vote in the Senate is, as, everybody, a lot of people I know basically spending time kind of whipping the vote in the jury. And we got those indicators because the trial started, if you weren't watching, with a review of all of the motions filed by both sides, defense motions, and then the responses by the prosecution. For the most part, there were a few prosecution-initiated motions. And most of the motions filed by the Paxton defense were an attempt to have the charges dismissed. So, going into the trial, and I think we said this last week, there was a possibility that this would have been a half a day of trial
Right.
had the senators voted to dismiss the charges. Theoretically, they could have dismissed some or all. As it turned out, they didn't none of the charges were dismissed.
Right.
But the various votes gave us a preliminary sense, and it is reading tea leaves. I mean, I think we have to talk a little bit about over-interpreting these results.
Right. Yes.
But one thing we definitely saw was there seemed to be, there were 6 votes in the Senate that were determined to, that voted to dismiss everything. They voted for the dismissal for every dismissal motion. And then they were joined by varying number, anywhere from 2 to 4 more senators. And I think they were joined by 4 more senators only on 1 vote.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
To my recollection.
Yep.
And that gave us some benchmarks, right?
Right, yeah, because we know, again, if you've been following this at all, they need 2/3 to convict and 2/3 to remove. That's 21 votes out of
2/3 of 30, because Senator Paxton is not going to be voting.
Right. 2/3 of the 30. Well, it's 2/3 of 31, but it's of the 30 votes.
Right.
So just
Now, she counts on the denominator, as he made a lot of several months ago.
So that's why it's 21 votes.
Right.
And so the real question, first and foremost, I think as we're watching this, we're thinking, okay, well, first, are there going to be enough votes to just dismiss some or all of these charges? And the answer is no. So then I think, from our perspective, this feels very comfortable political science. And so you say, okay, well now we've got some coalitions to look at, right? And you're right. Basically there were 16 dispositive motions, which would basically have, again, dismissed some or all the charges. So there's 6. So then I think, a lot of the questions I've been getting asked, are they going to get to 21? And I'm like, yeah, that's not really how I'm thinking about it. What I'm thinking about more so is, how does Paxton get to 11, right? Who are the 11 votes that he can count on to dismiss some or all of these charges, knowing that he's starting at 6? Now, that's an assumption. We're assuming that the 6 who voted basically to dismiss all of the motion, basically every article of impeachment through every channel available to them, will also vote to dismiss the charge when that comes.
And more importantly, we're assuming that just because you didn't vote for dismissal doesn't mean that you could be you still might be predisposed to not remove the Attorney General, even if you think it should all be aired out publicly.
Well, and I think that's the thing that I think, look, when I saw I said this to you at the time, I think for Paxton's team, the best case scenario would have been they get 11 or more votes, they get a majority to dismiss most of the charges, right, or something. Absent that, you say, okay, well, you'd like to get 11, right? Because they needed a majority on that, right? So that wouldn't get them there. But let's say they get 11, that would be the next best case scenario. This is probably maybe the third best case scenario, which is, to my mind, because what it is, I think, again, a lot of people are thinking about this in different sort of ways, but the idea is, if you think you've got 6 to 10 votes, that tells you how many senators you need to convince.
Sure.
Right? So ultimately there's, out of the body, the idea is you probably need to convince 5 senators to vote, basically to dismiss these charges at this point. Now, convince, pressure, whatever, we can talk about that. But that seems like, I would say it's not a Herculean task here, potentially. And I think, what you said, I totally agree with, which is, just because there were, anywhere between 21 and 26 votes to move forward does not mean that there are that many votes to convict. And the truth is, we talked about this last week with respect to our data. Absent, public opinion pushing in one direction or another on this stuff for Republicans, and we're still waiting to see if or when that happens. It seems to me the easiest way to kind of get out of this, if you're a Republican senator worried about a primary challenger, would be to say, look, these are really serious charges. We thought about it really, really carefully. We decided to go ahead with the trial. But now, having heard that, I don't think it's enough to overturn the will of the voters.
So, right. I think there's a million, people are parsing that out in a lot of different ways. I think just that, as you work through that in real time to some degree, it says a lot about just how much, again, and another theme here, how much uncertainty there is out there, because, what the math, how the senators are calculating those things, how we interpret those numbers. I was thinking about, how you sort of, first, second, third, and I know these are just rough.
Yeah.
I think there's probably, like so many things in this trial, there are probably reasons for optimism and reasons for concern on both sides.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? But also, I don't know, as we move forward, there'll be plenty of time to parse this again, but, who was surprising and who wasn't. And I think at this level, at this point, we're going to wait on that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think once we start getting into the second and third week and we start thinking in particular about those votes that moved back and forth a little bit, it's going to be really interesting to think about that because, in fact, that is where the swing votes are.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
I think the most, sort of glass half empty thing just about the votes was the fact on motion
Glass half empty for who?
for Paxton. On
Okay.
motion 20, which was Articles 9 and 10, those were the bribery counts, and that was a 6 vote or a 6 votes to
Right.
dismiss. And I thought, if you think about really where the meat of the substance might be in some of
Right.
this, the fact that on that one he only got to 6,
Right.
I think that'd be the one I'd be worried
Yeah,
about.
and obviously they don't have to convict on all of these
No.
to move into the vote, which will be a simple majority vote on whether to bar him from office or not.
Right.
So we saw that. I mean, I think another thing that was very interesting, and we're going to get to like the meaty thing, but another kind of interesting thing to see play out after all the speculation about this going into this, and speculation that was fueled by the gag order because we're not seeing a lot of direct arguments about this
Right.
because people were not supposed to talk about it. It was interesting to see what the competing narratives that each side was presenting to the jury and to the public. And we'll put a pin in the jury and the public for us to come back to. But, the prosecution argument looked about like we expected it, I think.
Yeah.
That, but interesting to actually see it articulated, not just that Paxton did all these things and they were kind of rude things,
Yeah.
but that Paxton violated the public trust
Right.
in his efforts to help Nate Paul at the expense of the public. And he used his power to push back when it was noticed by his otherwise loyal subordinates.
Right.
I think that captures about 90% of the narrative that is laid out, particularly when you start thinking about what was in the opening statement that Andrew Murr gave.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, and again, I keep saying this, and maybe I'm just being a wet blanket, but it's sort of like, yeah, we've heard this. But I mean, the thing that I think that they've done so far, the prosecution is sort of focused on in the trial, is to remind, especially the jurors, but I think also the public, that these were not, these lawyers who were pushing back, these were not rhinos, these are not secret Democrats, these are not like deep state bureaucrats. I mean, these are for the most part,
Right.
Very conservative, often extremely Christian, basically loyalists both to the party and the office. And that was the one thing I would say, I've sort of said like, yeah, I don't, in each of these data dumps, I'm sort of like, yeah, okay, I don't know what's new here. But the one thing I did think was new last time that they've really, I think, honed in on in the trial phase is the number of times that, these deputies raised objections.
Right.
How often they would say, hey, and again, the defense will get to that, but the defense is often say, oh, you didn't go tell him you were going to the FBI? What kind of loyalist are you?
Right.
Kind of thing. But one of the things that they've been laying out somewhat meticulously is both that these are not, these are not the people they've been described as,
Right.
number one.
Well, and that gets to what, in terms of what we saw, and we saw much more directly from Tony Busby what the defense argument was going to be, which part of it is the obvious thing, as you kind of alluded to there, which is, to attack every component of the defense argument, from the witnesses to the reliability of the narrative, the existence of the facts, the interpretation of the facts. I think all of that, again, I didn't want to get in the lawyer lane, but I think that's all, pretty much to be expected. But I think what was also interesting is, to my mind, was how closely the explicit argument being put forth by the defense corresponds to some of the public arguments that we've seen, particularly in sort of niche communications and the occasional media interview by Paxton's defenders. And that is that this was a self-interested plot by, as you say, these disloyal subjects.
Disloyal, maybe even deep state bureaucrats,
right.
whatever.
And their connection to other elements in the political world that were conspiring against Ken Paxton. And in its most rarefied form, at the end of the second day, I believe, the end of the first cross-examination of the first witness by Tony Busby, he came out and said it in his summing up of that cross. And he, in which he was in which he repeated the term coup, which was, tactically succeeded. I mean, I've heard the term coup in media coverage now. and said and basically what you guys were doing was staging a coup, and you staged. So what did you do? You went and had a meeting with the people in the governor's office, and then you had these communications with these other interest groups, and I don't remember how explicitly he tied it to TLR, but he already laid the Texans for Lawsuit Reform, but he already laid the foundation for that. So that's what you were doing. You guys were just staging a coup, and interesting in the directness of that and the inflammatory nature of the language. And as I've said, B, the way it aligns with the argument of a faction of Paxton's defenders.
Yeah.
I have questions and some doubts about how tactically sound that was in terms of appealing to the jurors.
Well, I mean,
in a couple of different ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a really specific moment related to that where, sort of came up about a specific political consultant, and the witness said, well, I'm sure this political consultant works for many of these. And they're like, let's move on. So they're like, it's like, well, let's not push this so far. But yeah, I mean, I agree. And it's interesting to me because, there's sort of this split screen going on. I mean, I think one of the things that sort of is important to acknowledge, and we're not lawyers, but it's sort of just interesting in and of itself, is sort of to remind oneself when watching this, it's not the defense's job here to prove Ken Paxton is innocent beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not to prove that everything that he did was ethical, moral, legal. It's just to sow enough doubt in the narrative that the prosecution is presenting to allow senators the room to let him off for this. And you're seeing a little bit of that going on and a little bit of this other thing going on. And I think, on the one hand, for the prosecution, they have to lay out this series of kind of complicated, we've talked about this before, about like, this is kind of complicated to describe in a short, this isn't there's not an elevator pitch to this in a lot of ways. So they're laying out all these distinct events and saying, look, these look pretty connected and we can connect them together for you. And if you connect them, it looks troubling. And it's easy enough for the defense to say, well, let's look at that first thing. Well, can't the attorney general hire somebody? Kind of this sort of, let's just pick it up that part. And that's a very, I think, just basic, that's a very good legal argument in front of a jury that maybe had no idea about this, let's just say as an example, right? But then to sort of wind it all up with this, and of course, we all know that this was a coup by these disloyal employees aligned with TLR, the governor, George P. Bush, and whoever other kind of boogeyman enemies we can kind of come up with. That's a very public argument, but I don't know how well that lands in the chamber with the people ultimately making these decisions.
What I've said to folks, and I think, is that it lands best with the votes I think they already have.
Yeah.
To the extent that there is, kind of a combination in those 6 votes we were talking about of, people that are frankly on the far right of the Republican caucus in the Senate. And then also those that are up for, some of those members are up for reelection in the next cycle. So this is very immediate to them. The way that has been wound up, and we'll see if they come back to this, and I suspect they will not, to tell your swing voters, and by the way, the implication is the governor's office and the governor were involved in this. Do you really want to sign off on that? Even if you think, I want to phrase this carefully, that one can make the argument that it's certainly in the governor's interest for the current attorney general to be deposed and for the governor to appoint his replacement, which is, we were all adults here. That would clearly be not a bad thing for Greg Abbott.
Sure.
But do you also really want to put people on the record as saying, yeah, I believe that this was all, a conspiracy and that, Governor Abbott was aligned with the rhinos, et cetera, right?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like a similar way I feel about, to the extent that the defense basically in some ways was, I don't really know how to put it, but using its time to sort of justify the investigative demands of Nate Paul on the AG's office. I mean, it's like, is this really what's going on here?
Now, one thing I do want to mention that we've left out in terms of just the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the defense tactics here, we have to remember that the rules are giving the prosecution a limited amount of time. They have 24 hours to present their case and present their witnesses. And so we should expect what we've seen, which is the defense to very much stretch out their cross-examinations and to burn as much of the prosecution's clock as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, but at the same...
Just to flag that.
I mean, that speaks to the fact that, I think for the defense here in particular, given that, look, these are not jurors who are coming to this not having heard something about it, who don't have predispositions over the case. I mean, this is not a normal jury, right? But it does sort of lay out, some of the... I don't know. I mean, just again, some of the challenges I think that the defense is facing because in filling out that time, right? Ultimately, I think a lot of it, I mean, like after the first day, I would say after really the Busby portion, with Mateer, a lot of it has been kind of very, I don't want to say ho-hum, but it has been kind of like, let's pick apart, every little piece of this. And you can see the senators back there, and I'm not naming names, trying not to fall asleep sometimes. I mean, this is,
There's a certain nigglingness to it, right? Where you're just kind of, they're just sort of poking and poking and poking. And that, that has, was more effective than with the most recent witness, but not.
Well, and it's also something.
But you're right. Over time, you're not really, are you really making progress with the jury here?
Yeah, and look, and it's not to say that it matters, but it does not matter. It does not matter in a real court of law too. Like, are you making a good, let's say, are you making a useful impression on the judge? Because I mean, one of the things I think I noticed yesterday was, at a certain point, like, the lieutenant governor was looking pretty irritated with the defense's counsel with the way that they were objecting.
Yeah.
And with, the fact they were interrupting a lot. And again, like, I'm not a lawyer. Maybe that's what they had to do. Again, this is, a bunch of lawyers might be watching this thinking, yeah, well, if I was part of this process, I'd be interrupting all the time too. Not commenting on that regardless. It does seem like, to the extent that like both sides have a well of goodwill, the defense's strategy requires, I think, probably spending that good capital, that goodwill pretty quickly.
And wanting to be careful to not overspend, at least theoretically.
Theoretically.
Now, as we've talked about this, we've already kind of gotten into the other point. One of the subjects I wanted to touch on in the trial, and that is the centrality in a very interesting way. I don't even want to call this centrality. The heavy presence of politics in this, right? And I think politics in a slightly different way than we've talked about it up to this point. I mean, there's a couple of overlapping conceptions here, but we spent a lot of time, much of the summer, frankly, discussing the inherently political nature of this process, quote unquote. That is, I want to really underline process in a kind of institutional and philosophical sense. Again, the Federalist Papers and all of that, and and we saw that back and forth in the motions. But after all that, the first week of this process has also revealed, just how intrinsic politics is to the arguments, to the subject of this, and to how both sides are going to proceed. I mean, there is just a lot of direct nods, invocation, reference to, what are essentially the kind of coalitional politics that we've seen inside the Republican Party, and that have really been driving a lot of politics in the state. I mean, there are a million examples, right? I think, but you can start with the opening statement of the prosecution and the witness introductions, that are designed to establish conservative credentials.
Right.
I mean, Andrew Murr's opening statement very much, painted Ken Paxton not just as having crossed ethical lines, but that he was, he had disappointed the expectations of conservative Republicans in his behavior and how he handled the office. I mean, it was almost it landed with a little bit of a thud, but it was notable when, Rusty Hardin basically just asked Mateer, "Are you a rhino?"
Yeah.
I mean, it's we're just going to do that, are we? Okay.
Right.
Various elements that are being used to color the events and the competing narratives. I mean, I tweeted about this. We had a funny Twitter thing on this, but I mean, all of a sudden you're reminded that, not reminded, I should reset that. Let me start again, counselor.
Try again.
Judge, try again. Yes, I'll try again. The prosecution made a real effort in talking about, the efforts to postpone the auction, to say, hey, look, every Republican in the state was trying to open up and create more space for COVID.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting return. And I think it was Mateer that then made the quip. It's like, when I looked at this, it was like something Anthony Fauci would do.
Like, whoa.
And it's like all of a sudden we're just back in that partisan, polarized view that has suffused so much of policy over the last few years. And it's just very interesting to me how that is just omnipresent as a tool for both sides but particularly because of the constellation of things, but particularly for the prosecution.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's sort of interesting on that fact that, if you were just sort of, if you were, again, an alien who was transported here and you're told about our system of government, and it's like, what have you learned over the last few days? Like, well, it turns out that everybody in the higher echelons of the Attorney General's office in Texas is extremely conservative.
Yeah.
Seeks out to, work in an extremely conservative manner, and that is like just the modus operandi of the institution.
It was a big day if you're kind of a, Federalist Society conspiracy person.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, then the flip side of it, then you've got, the defense coming up and telling us, telling the senators exactly how many votes Ken Paxton received in the last election, and what a prolific fundraiser he is, and how this is just one of many donations, and I guess you're all corrupt then, huh? Like, which again, I don't know if that's the tact I would take.
Yeah,
but
overly aggressive, I would say, but we'll see.
Yeah, but that's the really interesting thing to me. In some ways, like I haven't gotten to see Tony Busby in a courtroom. I've seen him in his other roles that he's played, more frequently. But one, I got to say, kind of impressive in a sense. Very central casting defense lawyer, like coming in, he's bringing the thunder. But there is part of me that is kind of like, and I think I wouldn't be the first person. That's like, how much of this is the Tony Busby show right now? And is that really serving Ken Paxton versus someone who would take maybe a little bit more of a procedural tact on some of this stuff?
Right. There's some brand burnishing going on here. It feels like hard not to think about it that way because there's so many other examples of that. But but the way so putting it that way and thinking about the way you pose that does kind of lead us then to the question, right?
Right.
In the role of politics in the approach and the messaging and the way that it's all being folded into these competing narratives, and thinking about how, the defense's style is landing. Mm-hmm. You put it, I think, good earlier. That, there's kind of an inherent split screen going on here in which, in addition to the, what has to be, you would think, the primary audience for this kind of a proceeding, and that is the jury.
Right.
But because of, again, the inherently political nature of this, the jury is also attuned to the broader audience and how this is landing with the public, and more specifically the electorate.
Yeah, and really specifically the Republican primary electorate.
Right. And so I think for me it's a constant effort to kind of say, okay, I can see how this is going to land with an audience out there that is already predisposed to be skeptical of this process because they are more or less worried about a Republican being moved out of office. Mm-hmm. But also, at the same time that you're thinking, and it's a very, and I guess the nub of it is that, you kind of alluded to this in terms of saying, look, how are a group of politicians going to respond to somebody going, well, that you can raise a lot of money and not get bought, right?
Yeah, right.
That lands very differently among the 31 senators and the 30 voting senators than it does with the public, I think. And different segments of the public.
Well, and that raises
to your point.
And I think that raises a really interesting question that we're just not going to know the answer to for a little bit, which is like how much and what of this is actually filtering through to the public. One of the interesting, results that we found in our poll we talked about last week was how, sort of the low percentage of people, about 30% or so, who say they've heard a lot about, Ken Paxton's legal problems, a little bit less have heard about the trial, but that was part of a larger battery where we asked about a number of things that were kind of going on at the time and really, it was really, in some ways, we're interested individually why, how much people are paying attention, but we were also really interested just to see, relatively speaking, where does the trial kind of land in terms of, where people's attention are. And what I think is kind of interesting is, it's sort of near the bottom, right? So, 31% said they'd heard a lot about the legal problems of Ken Paxton, 28% said they'd heard a lot about the impeachment and trial. Well, the legal problems of Donald Trump, 69%. Texas's placement of buoys and barbed wire at the border, 45%. Importantly, the legal problems of Hunter Biden, 44%. When we look at Republicans alone.
Well, also, we can't not add the next item on that list, I don't think, overall. We didn't even say the problems of just U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, 35%.
So more even on that sort of ongoing story.
Right.
But, 2 times the share of Republicans have heard a lot about Hunter Biden's legal problems than have heard a lot about Ken Paxton's legal problems. So twice the number. So, so I think, it's one of those things. So first and foremost, we have to say, okay, we don't even know how much people are paying attention. It's possible that with the commencement of the trial, the increased attention to the fact that it's leading local news right now, I think that's going to have some impact, at least on terms of people's attention to this. But then the next piece of this is like, what if this gets through? You and I are insane. I mean, like, we're sitting here, we've got our earbuds in, we're walking around.
And surrounded,
we're surrounded by other insane people.
By other insane people for much of our day, yes.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, you all, I say this with the most affection I can possibly muster it for all of us, right? I feel bad for us, maybe. But the thing is, we're sitting here watching this argument, talking about the split screen, all that, and then it's interesting to kind of wake up the next day and look at kind of what the press sweep looks like from this, and it depends on where you look, and to see what is getting picked up at. I mean, to your point, the word coup is getting got thrown around. I mean, that made it through, but to the extent that the defense is spending a certain portion of its time, partially to burn time, but also in reality, in an effort to basically create a message for very conservative Republican primary voters about what's going on here, to then, as a bank shot, put pressure back on, those senators who may be concerned about a primary challenge next time around. It's someone who works in public opinion and communicates, that's a pretty heavy lift.
Yeah, there's a lot of you're passing through a lot of filters.
Well, and the other thing, you're passing through a lot of filters, and I also suspect that the types of voters that we're talking about who are already paying a lot of attention to this probably have their minds made up.
Yes.
Right? And so...
Well, look, the polling in this poll illustrated that.
Yeah, exactly. When you look at the most conservative voters in the electorate, it's much more support for Ken Paxton, and then you look at sort of leaning conservative versus sort of just somewhat conservative. So the people who describe themselves as extremely conservative are significantly more supportive of Paxton, significantly more dubious of the charges. But I think those people, for the most part, I don't think the trial is likely to shift their views dramatically.
Right. But I think one of the other interesting things about that too, Josh, is that even among and it's one of the things that makes it very hard for us to call, and very hard, I think, for the senators. I don't feel sorry for them; they're senators, but for the Republican senators, there's not a trivial share of those extreme conservative or strong Republicans who are still reserving judgment. Yep, and that's I think the huge problem. Right.
That is definitely the huge problem.
For if you're trying to keep your eye, and look, again, inherently political process. You have elected officials. Right. It's baked into the process. They are going to be having an eye on their electorate.
Absolutely.
And there's nothing, there's nothing quote unquote wrong with that.
No, but again, it does come back to this whole notion of, I don't know. I mean, we're just watching. I think it's going to be interesting to see. I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether the defense's effort to shape a different narrative about what is going on, the extent to which that gains traction, both within the Republican electorate, within the most conservative elements of the Republican electorate, and then within the broader electorate, just out of curiosity. But again, there's sort of that piece of it. I mean, to me, that's the difficulty with this strategy is for that to work, it's going to have an effect on a pretty broad effect on the public, which is in turn going to put pressure on the senators. At the same time, without that effect, it just sort of might irritate the senators, more than anything. And again, look, is that relevant? Yes, I think it is relevant. I mean,
and to the extent that and we'll use this as a transition to talk for a few minutes before we go about the poll, but this is a very narrow casted message. But I've talked to a lot of reporters this week who really want to get to the bottom of why people aren't paying attention, why more people aren't paying attention now. As we've said in here, and I think we covered this pretty extensively last week, but just to add something to that, there are a lot of different parts of that, several of which we've mentioned today.
Sure.
But in the latest poll, which we published today, item 22 is the attention battery, if you will, with all those results that Josh has been talking about. If you're looking for one clear, grounded explanation for that, that I often, I think both of us probably tell reporters, look, it's a very crowded environment out there for people's attention. The results to Q22 really illustrate that. That's all the stuff you just read.
Yeah, and I think an important thing just there's, it's interesting to say this, but maybe on that, I don't know whether more attention helps or hurts and who exactly, but I mean, but this is where, Donald Trump's continued presence over everything is kind of important. I mean, just in the sense of, if you turn on, whether it's Fox News, One America, MSNBC, or whatever, his legal problems have been front and center for everybody. And, normally most of things of opinion we measure, we expect Democrats and Republicans look pretty different. When we say, how much have you heard about the legal problems of Donald Trump? 72% of Republicans say a lot. 72% of Democrats say a lot. So, the idea that people are going to jump down into sort of state level squabbles, for a lot of people, they just never do that anyway.
Well, that's another piece.
And I mean, another thing we asked about people, how much attention they were just paying to the legislature, and only 10% said they were paying a lot to the legislature, which is pretty normal.
Right. So have a look at that. let's do a couple of,
Yeah.
a couple of things from the poll. So, in terms of timing, we had asked over the last, during the week while the Paxton trial was going on, in the back half of the week, elsewhere in Austin, at least, initially, a federal judge who had been hearing the federal government's lawsuit against Texas, calling for them to remove the buoys that have been in the Rio Grande River for a couple of months now, I guess, ordered them removed. Now,
it's been stayed since then.
Yeah, that order has been stayed in, the last 24, in another 24 hours since then. But we polled on that and got interesting results, I thought.
Yeah, we saw, a slim majority of Texans supportive of the, basically the placement of these buoys and barbed wire at the borders. 52 support, 40 opposed. This is a much more traditional result. 88% of Republicans said that they were in support of deploying these barriers. 74% of Democrats were opposed. Independents, on balance, looked basically like the middle there. 51 support, 36 opposed. So this is one of those things where, like a lot of things, especially having to do with the border, it's incredibly divisive, but it's incredibly popular with Republican voters.
Right. And even though independents are in the middle, and as we say, the independents move, but generally in these areas, independents tend to look a little more like Republicans as a group than like Democrats.
Yeah, I mean,
not exactly, but a bit more.
Yeah, and to me, some of that might be, I'm unadvised about whether that has to do with the political predispositions of independents in the state of Texas on the one hand, or whether that has to do with the, basically continued fumbling of this issue by Democrats and sort of the fact that it is a one-sided discussion. I mean, ultimately, I think the thing about these policies is that, you may agree or disagree with the humanitarianness of them. You may agree or disagree about the effectiveness of them. But if you think that immigration is a problem of some magnitude at all, the state is doing things to seemingly deal with the migration issue. And the response, of the federal government on something like this is, well, don't do that.
Right.
And the question could be, well, what are you doing? And so I think that's, I think there's an asymmetry here that advantages, again, Republicans, we talked about it a lot here. And so I think you see that here too.
We have to go into it too much, but also, along those lines, and this has also been in the news this week because of the pushback against, frankly, the White House by Eric Adams in New York, who comes up a lot in this podcast. In terms of paying to bus foreign, we asked about, support or opposition for paying to bus foreign migrants awaiting their asylum hearings to other parts of the country outside Texas. Support was 48-41 with, similar amounts of partisan structure, I think.
Yeah, 77% of Republicans were in support, 69% of Democrats were opposed. And, it said, again, 50% of independents in support. So similar, I think the only issue that we tested, I think, 5 different policies that the state's engaging in right now. And the only one that really saw majority opposition and plurality and majority opposition was the practice of separating men from their families when apprehended crossing the border. That had 55% opposition. Still had 55% of support among Republicans, but almost a third were opposed to that. And we've seen stuff like this in the past.
Right.
Once you start kind of messing with the family structure, moving kids around, you start to get a little.
I think you get out of this. What is generally a pretty big safe harbor in this policy area for Republicans. Now, the other, I think the other kind of thing, the result that we got that speaks very much to debates we saw during the session, and even though it's kind of receded now because of the trial, like everything else has, we had interesting results in a public education battery where we, asked, repeated in pretty close form a list of items that we've asked before, asking in anticipation of the special session, asking how important it was for the legislature to address each of these following issues. And we got, I don't know if we should call these surprising or not. In some ways, they're not very surprising, but the extremes were a little surprising to me, maybe.
Yeah. So, basically, we designed this battery during the session in some ways because there were so many topics on the public ed agenda. I mean, if you really think about it, we don't have to go through it all, but there were a lot of things that they were definitely going to deal with, and they were talking about trying to deal with. And so we asked about, I think, about 8 of these to figure out, sort of what is, again, we're not asking people to make a choice. We're saying just how important is it for them to address this? And, way out front of everything else was school safety. 60% of voters said it was extremely important for the legislature to continue addressing school safety. 61% of Republicans, 62% of Democrats, 60% of independents all said it was extremely important. So that was at the top of the list. Then you jump down and there's, basically 3 that sort of saw about, a little bit, mid-40s support in terms of, or mid-40s saying it was extremely important. And those include parental rights, teacher pay and retention, and curriculum. Now, obviously, these split more naturally partisan. More Republicans said curriculum and parental rights than Democrats. More Democrats said teacher pay and retention than Republicans.
Right.
Those are basically the inverse. The real, in some ways, star of this battery was what came at the bottom, which was establishing basically a voucher, educational savings account, or some other type of school choice program in Texas. Only 26% of voters said that this was extremely important. So less than half who said the same about school safety. What was also interesting about this now, not surprisingly, Democrats, very low, it was the lowest on their list. Only 17% said it was extremely important, but only 34% of Republicans said this was extremely important. And you say, well, compared to what? Well, compared to the 65% who talked about parental rights, 60% who said the same of curriculum, 61% who said the same of school safety. So it's kind of at the middle to bottom of the Republican list of things that they thought the legislature should be focused on when it comes to public ed.
Right.
So that's just an interesting thing to put out there as we move our way forward.
And I think it helps, I think, understand why this is such a fight in a state dominated by Republicans.
Right.
Because despite the claims of advocates for some kind of, one of the, whatever you want to call it, some kind of a, way of providing public money for kids, for parents to send their kids to private schools, there's not a consensus among this in the Republican Party. I mean, I think, and to the extent that there is, that we frequently find, with broader measures, a majority saying, yeah, I support that. I'm fine with that. But it's soft.
Yeah, I would call that soft support. And part of it, look, it's soft because we've talked about some of these things, but, it's soft because most people don't have kids in school. Most people who have kids in school aren't looking to send their kids somewhere else because most people who have kids in schools like their public schools. Big shocker here. I mean, just throwing that out there.
They may at the same time have expressed less satisfaction systemically, but the things that are their proximate experiences are positive.
No, and that's the thing. I mean, we did a large institutional favorability battery with a bunch of different, both, state and local government, the military, the police, the public schools, as well as sort of business, labor unions, all these other things we did in this poll. It's notable that when you ask Republicans, whether they have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of public schools, the plurality have an unfavorable opinion. Which I think, in and of itself is like a minute to step back and think about what's going on here. But, when we ask parents and about the public schools, they have significantly more positive opinions. When we ask them about their own public schools, overwhelmingly positive opinions. And that's sort of where that's one of the places that the disjuncture comes in here, which is that, the most negative attitudes are coming from people who often are hearing about things from partisan sources about, whatever kind of, indoctrination is going on at the schools. But I don't think that's the experience of most people who are connected with it. And if you ask them, but is this the most important thing to you? The answer is going to be no, it's the border, or it's something else. And so,
or within the public education realm, no, it's school safety.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece of this is just the math of it. We've talked about this a million times, but again, for a rural Republican legislator, can your local school, let's say one of the local schools in your district, can that school accommodate 5 students formula funding leaving the school district without losing a teacher and however many classes that teacher teaches? And the answer is no.
And added to that now is, and this has been in the news recently, is a big school, legislators have heard this.
Yes.
Because this is not a new result. It's folded in with a lot of other politics around guns and school and mass shootings and those subjects. But, the legislature just passed the big school safety bill. But now there are a lot of stories probably that people are seeing in local media where schools are now being required to increase school safety by providing a school safety officer, and they're having trouble coming up with money for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the definition of an unfunded mandate. I mean, and they said, well, we gave school safety. Yeah, the school safety money that they distributed was like $30,000 per campus. Is that enough money to hire?
It's not an FTE.
It's not an FTE. Never good thing. We're at the university. It's not enough money to hire someone who is defined by statute as safe and competent to carry a gun around kids all day.
Right.
At the 9,000 plus campuses that, that Texas has to now apparently stock with an armed guard. But again, it's not even Texas. Texas isn't doing it. They passed it on to the local school district. So this is the thing here. It's, what the stories have basically been schools can't find people or just can't afford it.
Right.
And so we'll see how this plays out. But I mean, I'm not looking forward. in any way, shape, or form to seeing what, the aftermath is to the next shooting that's going to inevitably happen, when there's going to be a lot of finger pointing about who did or didn't do what, but also how serious of a response this was, given
Right.
that, they're not really funding this at the school district level.
Right. I think that's right. And so if you are interested in this, and I know that there are many people that are, again, you can go to the website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. If you go to the blog section in the polling section of the site, you'll find a link to graphics of these results and to the summary sheet that has all of this on it. This is Q28 on that sheet. So Josh, we're going to be back next week. We've talked about inviting a couple people in. Everybody's schedule is kind of scrambled by the trial and the various things going on. Still a lot more to talk about in these polling results that we'll keep. We also have results on discrimination, on our perceptions of group discrimination, on business interventions in politics, our usual batch of approval ratings and conditions out there, economic perceptions. So I urge you to go and have a look at that at the website. Thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks very much to our crew here in the College of Liberal Arts Development Studio. And thanks to you for listening. And we'll be back next week on some sort of schedule that accommodates all that's going on in the world. We'll talk more about the poll, and we'll keep track of the Paxton trial. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.